There is something almost instructive about watching powerful people fail, not in a pleasurable sense. There is nothing pleasurable about a war that has killed thousands of Iranian civilians, bombed schools and hospitals, displaced millions, and sent the global oil price to levels that are making ordinary people across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even inside the United States significantly poorer. There is nothing pleasurable about that. But there is something genuinely instructive about watching an empire that believed its own propaganda walk into a strategic catastrophe that every honest analyst of the region could have predicted, and then watching that empire scramble to explain why the catastrophe is actually a success. And that is precisely what we are now witnessing as this war enters its second month with none of its stated objectives achieved, the Strait of Hormuz still closed, Iranian missiles still reaching Israel, American aircraft destroyed at Saudi air bases, and Donald Trump on Truth Social extending deadline after deadline for threats he has no capacity to execute on schedule. I want to spend today explaining, methodically and precisely, why the United States and the Zionist regime wanted a quick victory, what their calculation was, why that calculation was fundamentally wrong, and what the failure of that calculation means for everyone on this planet. Because I think this is genuinely important for Western audiences to understand. Not because I want Western audiences to feel sympathy for the Islamic Republic, but because the people of the United States, the people of Europe, the people of every country whose economy is being damaged by a war they had no vote in, deserve an honest account of how this happened and why the people who launched it were so catastrophically mistaken about what they were doing. Let us begin with the calculation. What did the United States and the Zionist regime actually believe when they launched Operation Epic Fury on February the 28th? Britannica has described it plainly. Given Iran's weakened position, the United States and Israel calculated that they had a greater opportunity to advance their objectives through military means than through diplomatic means. That is the precise formulation. Iran was weakened. The 12-day war of June 2025 had degraded its defenses and its nuclear infrastructure. The nationwide protests of late December 2025 and January 2026, which the United States actively encouraged and which the Iranian government suppressed with considerable force, had demonstrated domestic instability. Iran's regional allies had been weakened, particularly after the fall of Assad in Syria in December 2024, and the degradation of Hezbollah and Hamas through years of Israeli campaign. The Iranian currency had collapsed, the economy was under severe strain, and the American intelligence community and the Israeli military establishment looked at all of these factors together and concluded that the window was open, that this was the moment, that a sufficiently powerful, sufficiently rapid assault could achieve what sanctions and proxy wars and the 12-day war had not. The destruction of the Islamic Republic as a regional power capable of resisting American and Israeli hegemony. That was the calculation. And it was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in its peripheral details while correct in its fundamentals, wrong at the level of its most basic premises. And I want to explain exactly why. Because understanding why requires understanding something about Iran that the Western propaganda machine has spent decades preventing Western audiences from understanding. The first premise that was wrong was the premise about Iranian domestic instability. The protests of January 2026 were real. The economic pain that drove them was real. The suppression was brutal and real. But the conclusion drawn from those protests that the Islamic Republic was on the verge of internal collapse and that a military assault would accelerate or complete that collapse was not grounded in any serious understanding of Iranian political sociology. What the Western propaganda machine consistently misreads about Iran is the relationship between ordinary Iranians' frustrations with their government on domestic economic issues and those same Iranians' response to foreign military aggression against their country. These are not the same thing. A population can simultaneously be frustrated with its government's economic management and united in its resistance to a foreign power bombing its cities and killing its children. These positions are not contradictory. They are, in fact, entirely normal human responses to two entirely different types of situations. What happened when the bombs fell on February the 28th is what happens in virtually every country when it is attacked by a foreign military power. The population rallied. The young people who had participated in protests, who had been influenced by Western narratives, who had grievances against the Islamic Republic, watched their schools being bombed, their neighborhoods being struck, their supreme leader being killed, and they drew the obvious conclusion about who the actual enemy of the Iranian people was at that moment. It was not their own government, it was the foreign power that was dropping bombs on their cities. I was in Tehran. I attended gatherings where missiles fell on the crowd. People did not run, they continued to stand. That is not the behavior of a population prepared to welcome an American-imposed transition. The second premise that was wrong was the premise about Iranian military vulnerability. The 12-day war of June 2025 had damaged Iranian air defenses. It had struck nuclear facilities. It had killed senior military commanders and nuclear scientists. And the American and Israeli establishments looked at that damage and concluded that Iran's military capacity had been fundamentally degraded, that another larger assault could finish what the 12-day war had started. This conclusion was wrong because it misunderstood the nature of Iranian military preparation. The Islamic Republic has spent 30 years building redundancy into every element of its military architecture, precisely because it knew that this moment would eventually come. It distributed its missile assets. It went underground. It developed cheap, easily replenished weapons at scale. It built production facilities in hardened, dispersed locations. The damage from the 12-day war, while real, did not eliminate the underlying architecture of Iranian deterrence. It removed visible elements of a system specifically designed to survive the removal of its visible elements and continue functioning from its hidden ones. After more than 10,000 strikes against Iran over 4 weeks, according to reporting from independent monitoring sources, Iran is still launching missiles and drones daily. This is the documented reality on the ground. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Oil has gone from oversupplied in February to trading above $110 per barrel. The IEA has described this as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Iran struck the Mina al-Ahmadi refinery in Kuwait twice. It struck South Par's gas field and triggered retaliatory strikes across the Gulf that Trump claimed to have no knowledge of, which nobody seriously believes. It destroyed an E-3G Sentry AWACS aircraft at Prince Sultan Air Base. It damaged multiple KC-135 aerial refueling tankers in 2 separate strikes at the same facility. It has wounded American soldiers at multiple locations across the region. All 13 of the United States regional bases have been struck, with some reports suggesting all have experienced periods where they were not fully operationally functional. And yet the White House press secretary continues to say that Iranian military capabilities are being crippled day by day. Marco Rubio continues to say the operation is ahead of schedule. J.D. Vance has said that most of the goals of the war have been achieved. And simultaneously, Trump is extending his deadline for striking Iranian power plants not once, not twice, but for the 3rd time, because he understands, even if he will not say it publicly, that executing that threat will trigger Iranian retaliation against Gulf energy infrastructure on a scale that produces exactly the global economic depression that I and many other analysts have been warning about. You cannot simultaneously claim to have achieved your objectives and extend your deadline for escalation because you are afraid of the response. These are contradictory positions. But the Western media largely accepts both simultaneously because accepting the contradiction would require confronting the failure, and confronting the failure requires confronting everything that led to it. The third premise that was wrong was the premise about what a quick decapitation strike would produce. On the first day of this war, the Zionist regime killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. This was presented as a decisive blow. The expectation, at least in some quarters of the American and Israeli establishment, was that killing the supreme leader would produce the kind of leadership vacuum and institutional confusion that would make organized resistance impossible. What happened instead was that within a week, the Islamic Republic operated under its constitutional three-person transitional leadership structure, the president, a representative of the Guardian Council, and the head of the judiciary, without chaos, without public disorder, without any of the institutional collapse that had been anticipated. On March the 8th, Mujtaba Khamenei was elected supreme leader by the Assembly of Experts, a constitutionally designated elected body. He received the pledged allegiance of the IRGC, the armed forces, the parliament, and the civilian leadership. Trump called him a lightweight and threatened that he would not last long without American approval. China called his election constitutionally legitimate. The Houthis called it a victory for the Islamic Revolution, and the new supreme leader's Iran continued to fire missiles at Israel and strike American assets across the region. This is what the Western propaganda machine does not understand about the Islamic Republic. It is not a one-man regime whose removal produces collapse. It is an institutional structure with checks and balances, with an elected parliament, with a directly elected president, with city councils, with a constitutional framework that was stress-tested under war conditions and held. Western analysts kept insisting there was nobody to talk to after Khamenei's death. Within a week, there was a new supreme leader. The country held together. The armed forces retaliated. The Strait of Hormuz remained closed. The missiles kept flying. Now I want to address the divergence that has been developing between Washington and the Zionist regime, because I think it is highly illuminating about the nature of what has gone wrong. The Washington Post reported that when the war began, the United States and the Zionist regime were perfectly in sync on their sweeping goal of regime change. That alignment has fractured. The Zionist regime struck South Pars gas field, one of the world's largest natural gas deposits, apparently without full American coordination. Trump claimed he was not aware of it. The Zionist regime has been described as speeding up its targeting in Iran over critical 48-hour periods, trying to hit arms factories before any ceasefire can be declared, in what appears to be an effort to ensure the war continues, regardless of what American diplomatic messaging suggests. A senior American official told reporters that the Zionist regime had oversold the likelihood of regime change to the Trump administration. There are reports of tense calls between Vance and Netanyahu in which the American side expressed frustration at the gap between what was promised and what has been delivered. This is the dynamic I have been describing from the beginning. The United States is not in control of its own foreign policy in this region. It is a powerful but to a significant degree manipulated actor whose decisions have been systematically shaped by the Zionist lobby, by the Epstein class that owns the media and funds the political campaigns, and by the genocidal regime itself. Trump wanted to be the deal maker who solved Iran in 4 to 6 weeks. He was told by people whose interests were served by war rather than peace that a quick, decisive military victory was achievable. He was told that the Iranian population was on the verge of revolt. He was told that Iranian military capabilities had been fundamentally degraded by the 12-day war. He was told that a decapitation strike would produce leadership collapse. He was given a picture of Iran that was constructed not from the actual Iran, but from the imaginary Iran that the Western propaganda machine has been maintaining for decades. And now, 1 month in, he is extending deadlines, talking about winding down a war that has not achieved its objectives, sending more Marines to a region where American soldiers are being wounded, and trying to find an exit from a situation that the people who put him in it have no interest in letting him exit cleanly. Iran has responded to the American 15-point proposal with its own 5 conditions. Those conditions include war reparations. They include recognition of Iranian rights over the Strait of Hormuz. They include security guarantees for Iran's regional allies. They include the cessation of all hostilities. They include accountability for what has been done to Iranian civilians, Iranian infrastructure, Iranian cultural heritage. Iran countered a 15-point surrender document with 5 minimum conditions that reflect what this war has actually demonstrated about the balance of power in the region. The Strait of Hormuz is not open. It was open before this war began. The United States launched a war and closed it, and now it wants Iran to reopen it as a precondition for ending the war the United States started. Iran says no. The facts on the ground must change first, and the facts on the ground 1 month into this war are that the United States has not achieved regime change, has not opened the Strait of Hormuz, has not eliminated Iranian missile capability, has not seized the enriched uranium stockpile, has not produced internal collapse, has not deterred Iranian retaliation, has not protected its aircraft at Saudi air bases, and has not convinced a single major ally to join the effort to reopen the strait by force. The IEA has urged people across the world to work from home and avoid air travel. Oil prices topped $110 per barrel, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Kuwait declared a national energy emergency. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency. Countries across Asia and Africa are restricting business hours because they do not have sufficient fuel to keep their economies running at normal capacity. All of this from a war that was supposed to last 4 to 6 weeks and produce a decisive American victory. This is what failure looks like, not the dramatic, visible, acknowledged failure of a collapsing army retreating from a battlefield. The subtle, deniable, propaganda-managed failure of a campaign whose every objective remains unmet a month after it was launched with the largest American military buildup in the Middle East since 2003. The failure of a strategy built on a fictional Iran that does not exist, confronting the real Iran that does. The failure of an empire that believed its own propaganda, making a decision based on that propaganda and discovering too late that the real world does not conform to its narratives. The Zionist regime wanted to use this moment to permanently destroy Iran as a regional counterweight to its ethno-supremacist expansion. It wanted to take advantage of what it perceived as a window of Iranian weakness and close that window permanently. It has not done so. Iran is weaker in some specific military dimensions than it was before February the 28th. But the Islamic Republic is standing. The new supreme leader has the allegiance of every major Iranian institution. The population has rallied. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. The missiles continue to fly. And the world is watching and drawing its own conclusions about the reliability of American commitments, the limits of American military power, and the degree to which Washington has lost control of its own foreign policy to a genocidal client that does not share American interests and does not care about American casualties. This war was a miscalculation. It was always going to be a miscalculation because it was based on a misreading of Iran so fundamental and so sustained that no amount of additional intelligence or additional firepower was going to correct it. The real Iran was never going to behave like the imaginary Iran. And the gap between those two Irans is where Operation Epic Fury has spent its 4 weeks discovering the difference between what the Epstein class told Donald Trump would happen and what the Islamic Republic of Iran was actually prepared to make happen. That gap is the story of this war, and it is a story that is not yet finished.